We present today the last session in this series titled COVID-19 and the Future of U.S.-China Relations. I am Christine Thompson, Executive Director of the Executive Education team at the Smith School of Business, and we are working in partnership with our Office of Alumni Relations to power this series. We would especially like to welcome our Smith and University of Maryland alumni and current students who have joined us today from across the world. We appreciate your time and hope you find this a valuable source of learning. Please be aware that we are recording this session in full so that we can post the digital recording to the Maryland Smith website later this week. Next slide, Dr. Gupta.
Yes.
Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Gupta, who is now a familiar face to most of you. Dr. Anil K. Gupta is the Michael Dingman Chair in Strategy, Globalization, and Entrepreneurship at the Robert H. Smith School of Business, the University of Maryland in College Park. He is ranked by Thinkers 50 as one of the world's most influential living management thinkers and has been named by The Economist as a superstar for research on emerging economies. A member of the World Economic Forum's Global Expert Network, he is the author of several influential books, including The Quest for Global Dominance, Getting China and India Right, and The Silk Road Rediscovered. Dr. Gupta is also a celebrated professor and has earned many teaching awards. I want to personally thank him again for his support of this important webinar series. Next slide, please. Thank you. Before Dr. Gupta begins, we want to ask everyone to please keep your microphones on mute to reduce any background noise. Dr. Gupta will be presenting his material for 25 minutes, followed by an approximately 20-minute question answer period. Please post your questions in the chat area, and I will remind you to do that. And Dr. Gupta and I will address them during the Q&A time. I will turn it over to Dr. Gupta right now. Anil, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good morning and good evening to my friends in the US and certainly in Asia. I believe there are people from China, from India. This is a very sensitive topic in terms of US-China relations. And of course, as somebody who has very close friends and actually relatives in both US and China, I have tried in this presentation to be as analytical as possible, but at the same time, I accept the possibility that it could be more, let's say, a US perspective, but I've tried to stay analytical rather than take a US perspective or a China perspective. So the big question that I try to answer here is that the coronavirus is a once-in-a-century pandemic. It's a kind of crisis that could bring the world's economic and technology superpowers closer, and the question is, will it? And I think I look at this question as really almost like throwing a log into a river, a piece of, like a tree, a piece of wood into the river. But then, of course, what happens to that piece of wood, what it does, that's important, but it needs to be looked at in the context of how the river is flowing. And when I say how the river is flowing, I'm talking about really the arc of history, the nature of the relationship between US and China, which has, over the last several decades, certainly from 1949 onwards, become multi-dimensional and more complex. Used to be at one time, US would talk about human rights questions, but then over the years, there is economic issues, certainly technological issues or technology issues, scientific research and collaboration, the education in terms of Chinese students in particular studying in the US, and the geopolitical. So it has become a lot more multidimensional. And I look at that arc of history, how the river is flowing and whether the flow of the river would be affected, and if so, how, by the coronavirus situation. So just, if I look at the major developments, the key milestones, of course, starting from 1949, because the US government had supported the Chiang Kai-shek, and so therefore it started the relationship in the current era with antagonism towards China, but it was really around the US perspective regarding communism and the military aspects of the relationship. A major turning point in the relationship came 20 years later, when Beijing and Moscow essentially broke up their relationship. And that opened up an opportunity for both Beijing and the US to turn the tide. And that led to the ping pong diplomacy, Kissinger's visit to China, and of course, the Nixon's visit to China. And so that was a major turning point. And despite various things, turbulations that happened but after 1969, then, until for the next 30 odd years, the relationship continued to become better, stronger, more harmonious. And in 2001, US deliberately paved the way for China to join the WTO. In some sense, we could say on the positive side of the relationship, this was the major high point. And after that, the relationship started to become more multidimensional and more complex. Already by 2001, the relationship had become not just from the US side, talking about the human rights questions, but also now the economic. And that economic dimension continued to, in fact, power all other aspects of the relationship from over the last 2 decades. And as we can see that China, in fact, China's economic weight in terms of share of world GDP has gone from 3.6% to now closing in on about 16% or so today, currently. The US has lost some ground over the last 20 years, but not a lot. I think the ground that has been lost has been by Japan and certainly by Europe. And so as China has become more powerful, the tensions between US and China have become stronger and have become more multidimensional. And obviously with economic power comes military power, comes technological power. And so that added contentions and almost like, once again, sort of the end of the notion that, will China's rise be peaceful? Once again, I think that's from the US side. 2010, China becomes the world's second largest economy. But then, as the tensions begin to increase, the end of era of cooperation begins to, let's say, show weaknesses, begins to fray. So under Obama, 2012, the growing trade deficit and China restricts export of rare earth metals, and then US and its allies file case with the WTO. 2013, an attempt by Obama and President Xi to reset the relationship, a meeting in California to vow to establish a new type of great power relations. Will it happen? Well, I mean, just a year later, US indicted some Chinese nationals in terms of on charges of stealing US technology and the relationship, there were some high points once again in 2014 late, which is around climate. So it set the momentum for the 2015 Paris Accord. So that was very, very good. But then another, few months later, the military tensions raise their ugly head. And US gets increasingly concerned about South China Sea. The low point under Obama, and it has unfortunately continued to go lower, was when towards the 2016, towards the end of his presidency, Obama's visit to China, where in fact when his plane landed in China, there were no stairs waiting for him. And it's a fair, probably speculation that might have been deliberate on the part of China as a snub to Obama. So you can see that the relationship already was headed downhill. An attempt to perhaps reset once again in 2017, early in his presidency, Trump hosted President Xi at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Glimmers of hope that the relationship might actually become more harmonious. But then the trade tensions escalate very, very rapidly. Initiated obviously from the US side in terms of imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, and China retaliated, as we can see in this chart, that in terms of US tariffs on Chinese exports to the US, average for all the exports from China, they went from less than 5% to actually almost 25% very, very rapidly. So that's a major escalation. And then, we had a few months later. Now here we can see a very clear hardline approach. Vice President Pence's speech at the Hudson Institute, where he explicitly said that the US will prioritize competition over cooperation, combat China's, as he put it, economic aggression. He condemned what he said, growing Chinese military aggression, and obviously concerns about American intellectual property. So this was, we can see, a major escalation, certainly in the rhetoric, but also backed up by US actions. A few months later, US had hesitated to label China in, let's say, in formal terms, a currency manipulator, but those inhibitions go away, and the US formally labels China a currency manipulator. Again, further escalation that Trump officially signs a bill to support Hong Kong protesters. But then, of course, once again, it's almost like, the relationship goes back 2 steps, but goes ahead 1 step. But overall, I think the relationship still is more like, 2 steps back, 1 step forward, rather than 1 step back and 2 steps forward. But still, in terms, there was the phase 1 trade deal that was signed. So here you see Liu He and Trump shaking hands in early January. But then, of course, that really was a truce. We wouldn't call it a major reset. Trump did not remove any of the tariffs that had been imposed. So the tariffs average slightly less than 25%, continue. And as most observers said, don't be fooled by the trade deal. It's just, kind of putting a paper on a relationship that's already extremely fragile. Now, from the US side, that US leverage, if you will, from White House, from Congress, a sense that perhaps US leverage is not that weak, because as Chinese economy slows down, US economy slowed down, but still compared to Europe, US economy has continued to, let's say, remain steady in terms of its growth rate. Also, perception that US leverage is not weak to demand concessions, if you will, from China, because China's reliance on exports has significantly slowed down over the last, almost 10 years. And of course, there are several factors that are behind that. And then, again, a concern from the US side about trade deficit with China. So if you look at, obviously, not just the absolute numbers over the last 20 years, but if you look at as percentage of US GDP, from less than 1% to now getting 1.6%. So that's the big concern. Of course, from an economic analysis point of view, there strong arguments, valid arguments are made that countries should not be concerned about trade deficit. But at the same time, there are other analyses which point out that even though macroeconomically, US may not need to be concerned about trade deficit with China, but it has hurt jobs in certain manufacturing states of the US that are politically important, both for Trump as well as for the Democrats. So those concerns fueled by, for instance, IMF data that in terms of average tariffs, not just on goods from the US, but from actually across the world, that tariffs in China, while they have come down, they still are higher than average for emerging market economies as well as from the advanced economies. And on top of that, naturally, China's announced goals regarding in the area of leading edge technologies. They begin to raise concerns for the US. And that's what I meant by that the relationship becomes multi-dimensional. And naturally, on the technology front, 5G and AI are the major game changers. And then once again, China has ambitions and it has every right to have those ambitions. But at the same time, on the US side, they create a concern so that it's no longer really about cooperation, but about competition. And if we assume, and actually we don't have to assume, this is a reality, that 5G will be a complete game changer in terms of almost all aspects of all sectors of the economy, but more than economy, other non-economic dimensions, that Huawei's market share has been growing significantly at the expense of Nokia and Ericsson. And US and its allies have been concerned about excessive dependence on Huawei. So US tensions, rather US trade actions against Huawei. And of course, not just Huawei, but broadly speaking, the technology sector, especially the semiconductor sector in China. So Canada arrested the Huawei executive, obviously at the behest of the US. So that made the situation worse. And the thing to keep in mind is that actually concerns or the tensions between US and China from the US side, they cut across the political divide, Democrats and Republicans. Obama, when he was president, and we saw the direction the relationship already was taking, and Trump now. So therefore, we don't know what will happen in the 2020 U.S. elections, but the broad arc of history is unlikely to be changed if, in fact, a Democrat is in the White House next year, because the perspective on this particular issue, there is a relatively high degree of agreement. Obviously, there've been questions about how much leverage China has over the U.S. because it is a holder of U.S. T-bills. Yes, of course, China is a major holder of U.S. T-bills. But in the broader, if you look at the total picture, the first, of course, if China were to dump U.S. T-bills, it would be hurting itself because that would bring down the value of the dollar. And so Chinese holdings would reduce in value. But more than that, if we just look at the percentage of U.S. T-bills that are held by various countries, so China is an important player, but not a dominant player. Coming now, if you're looking at that arc of history and the current situation regarding the coronavirus, so this has actually made, it could have hypothetically, made the situation better. This is as I said at the beginning, the biggest, once in a century type of crisis that the world faces, and we are by no means out of it. Certain parts of the world, perhaps, maybe China, perhaps, but actually the river has been flowing in a direction with relatively high speed, and that has been going from cooperation to competition to contention, conflict, and so on. So in that situation, the coronavirus did not help. And both sides have been fueling. So on the Chinese side, obviously, there have been kind of statements made sometimes by official spokespeople that perhaps it could have been the US military that brought the coronavirus to China. Obviously, the US doesn't particularly like that. This is another, let's say, story along those lines. And then, of course, China expels the American journalists. So all of these things just over the last few weeks, 6 weeks, made the situation worse. And, there has been tit for tat. So Trump, instead of saying coronavirus or COVID-19, Trump has been using the term Chinese virus. So it's really kind of you poke me in the eye and I poke you in the eye. The US intelligence has said that China concealed the extent of virus outbreak. So therefore, instead of, let's say, letting things slide, the US side has been pushing the argument, pushing the narrative that it's actually China that bears the responsibility for the crisis that the world faces, in terms of that if the extent of the virus outbreak had been, let's say, the information had been released earlier, perhaps more completely, we might be in a better situation. And of course, U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, he did not help matters in terms of, let's say, cooling down the tensions when he said that this outbreak is an economic opportunity for the U.S. in terms of that it would bring jobs back to the U.S. From China. So, I mean, where this is now, this was a relationship that was already headed towards more contention rather than cooperation. And the coronavirus situation, the pandemic, has actually marked almost, we could say, this is the end of the notion of Chimerica, which is China and America, the two superpowers collaboratively, let's say, in some sense, laying out the rules of global order, that instead of a collaborative relationship, instead of a G2, what we have here is a messy breakup. Orwell Shell, and I picked up this article from Orwell Shell because in the US, Orwell Shell from Asia Society is regarded as perhaps the #1 China expert. And he has been one of the major proponents of a cooperative relationship, a harmonious relationship between the US and China. So, when he calls this an ugly end of the relationship, that carries weight. And so, and then it's also reflected in terms of, Pew Research Center and their surveys about views that of Americans, they have turned significantly more negative. There are further kind of breakdown of this data, and that this turn is on both the Democratic citizens as well as Republican citizens. There's not no data over the last 5 years from China in terms of how the Chinese perspective of Americans. So we have anecdotes, but not let's say quote unquote hard data to talk about. One glimmer of hope is that this goes back to actually 2015, but probably these numbers would not have changed all that much, which is that in both countries, US and China, the younger generation, which is the dark green color, that the younger generation on both sides, by vast margins, view the relationship with the other country, view the other country much more positively. Could therefore, in a generation, perspectives on the two sides be a lot more positive rather than negative? Let's hope at least there is some basis for that hope. Also, just talking about the end of the, let's say, collaborative relationship, or certainly moving rapidly downhill towards the end of the collaborative relationship. So if you look at scientific collaboration, so this is from Nature, one of the two most respected science journals, that, if you look at the size of the arrows, the thickness of the arrows, that globally, in terms of scientific collaboration, US and China have had the most robust scientific collaboration, the thickest collaboration. But now that is coming apart. If you look at restrictions that the US has imposed on visas, not student visas, but on actually scientists wanting to come, for collaborative work in the US, so restrictions on visas, and just, even on projects funded by the NIH, by the NSF, in terms of the restrictions on collaborations with, as the the government, U.S. government says foreign entities, but it's in fact below in between the lines. It's really in fact talking about China. What's happening in terms of the Chinese students in the U.S. I think both sides. It's certainly from my own interactions, my own direct experience, that Chinese students remain eager to come and study in the US, and the US side remains welcoming very much of Chinese students. But here, not really the COVID-19 situation, but if you look at the broad trends that since over the last 10 years, that even though the number of Chinese students studying in the US is higher than ever, but driven by demographic trends in China as the population gets older, driven by the growing strength of Chinese universities, that there has been an absolutely steady decline in the growth rate. And so no matter, even if COVID-19 had not happened, or coronavirus had not happened, Trump had not being the president, I think it's a reasonable speculation that on its own, because of the other trends, demographic and growing strength of Chinese universities, probably 5 years from now, by 2025, the number of Chinese students in the US would be smaller than what it is, let's say, this year. So that's again is, in some sense, you can say, a weakening of the ties. And this is a situation, if we, and this is something where neither side is helping the relationship. Obviously, US is playing its part in terms of looking at China as vulnerable, looking at itself as being threatened by the rise of China, and therefore taking actions. On the other side, China, for instance, if you look at within Asia, China's, let's say, perception has not really become a whole lot more favorable among its neighbors, whether it is Japan or South Korea, or even Philippines, India, Indonesia, Australia. And so I think both sides have played a contributing role to the fraying of the relationships. Now, where do we go from here? Will it be a hot war or a cold war? And I think here I very much subscribe to the analysis by Graham Allison, probably the #1 geopolitical analyst in the US, a professor at Harvard. And he wrote this book, about Destined for War. And he said over the last 500 years, he looked at 16 cases where a challenger and #2 started to challenge #1. And out of those 16 cases, in 12, 75%, it actually led to a hot war. But actually, so I think I would say we have to accept that US and China are in a state of war. The question is, will it become a hot war? It does not have to. And so therefore, how do you manage a cold war, which is, still peaceful, but tensions? And this is, once again, going to Graham Allison's recommendations, how to manage a cold war is understand that a hot war would be madness, essentially mutually assured destruction of both sides. But then, how do you keep the war to be cold war? It's from a game theory point of view that both sides have to be prepared to risk a war that you cannot, spelling mistake, cannot win. That is how both sides, in fact, hold back. Define the rules of engagement, whether it is on climate or on communication or on, in fact, students and scientific cultural exchanges. To define, like in the US and USSR, there were rules of engagement which kept put some boundaries around the war from becoming a hot war, and rather than just staying as a cold war. Obviously, domestic performance, US economic performance, US technological performance, China's economic and technological performance has a huge impact on the relative strengths of the two countries and their perception of the relative strength or weakness. And then the other thing is, as Alison said, that hoping that the other side will change. The other side may, China may hope that the US perspective would change if, let's say, the elections turned out to be in favor of the Democrats, or the US may hope that China would change. That may happen. But strategy is not really putting your future in the hands of hope. So I think that is where I would probably want to conclude, is to say it's a relationship. The river has been flowing with growing, let's say, strength, growing power, growing velocity. And COVID-19 is like a log that has been thrown into that river. But the impact of COVID-19 to change the course of that river really is, even COVID-19 seems unlikely. If anything, it has made the situation more contentious. But at the same time, there are two areas of optimism. One is that it is very likely, it is possible for it to remain a Cold War for decades if necessary. And second is that maybe in a generation, as the younger people of today, who are a lot more positively disposed to the other side, as they become the major decision makers. So with that, I think, yes, we do have not 20 minutes, but 15 minutes for a Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gupta. Much appreciated. Let me start with the topic of manufacturing and kind of maybe the U.S. and China centricity on that. Do you believe that there will be some kind of knee-jerk reaction to moving manufacturing from China back to the U.S.? Do you think that's a logical or a short-term or a longer-term strategy? Maybe you can discuss that for a minute.
Yeah. So actually, the already there has been a shift of manufacturing from, and over the last 10 years, a shift of manufacturing from China, not so much to the US, but more to other Asian countries, Vietnam foremost, to some extent Indonesia, to some extent India. So there has been a shift of manufacturing away from China because, of course, Chinese labor costs have been rising relative to the other locations. So that, but also there has been a shift of manufacturing because technology has been moving up ahead, and so therefore automation, which means that labor costs become less of a factor. So already shift of manufacturing away from China to rest of Asia, to the US, Mexico, that has been going on already for the last 10 years. I think the Trump tariffs have accelerated that particular trend. So, if you look at announcements by Apple, by Foxconn, and so on, that in terms of manufacturing, shifting some of the manufacturing from China to the US. Yeah, but that's not a new trend. I mean, it gets speeded up, but that's an ongoing trend.
Great, thank you. Thinking about the same kind of concept, but thinking about Europe and perhaps India, do you have any thoughts on either of those countries and their interactions in this manufacturing side of things?
Yeah. So the Europe, once again, I mean, the Europe vis-a-vis China, the situation is similar as US vis-a-vis China. So nothing more that one would add there. Looking at India, India has not benefited as much from the shift of manufacturing away from China that has been going on. But that's because historically, India has been not as strong in manufacturing as it needs to be, and certainly not as strong in manufacturing as some of these Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN countries. But at the same time, certain things are happening. For example, a major part of international trade is electronic goods. And India is now a major, in some areas like mobile phones, it is the second largest market for electronic goods. And as the scale of India's market has become significantly larger, companies themselves find it actually advantageous to manufacture in India for India, rather than export from China to India. And of course, as the scale of manufacturing in India builds up, that has an impact on the supply chain of components. So that begins to shift to India. And now it's in the early stages of India becoming an exporter of electronic goods. So in that case, there have also been, in fact, some Chinese companies like Xiaomi and others that have hinted that maybe at some point, India could start exporting electronic goods to China. So we have to see how that plays out.
Very good, thank you. What are your thoughts around the capital market outcomes from this engagement and relationship situation?
So by capital markets, I'm thinking about really, what people are talking about are investments. And so of course, investments can be portfolio investments, just kind of buying shares of companies in the other country, or it can be FDI, which is actually investing in a plant, factory, office activities on the ground. So I think if we look at from the US to China, the FDI has not been growing, but that again is something because a lot of the FDI that went from the US into China was not, or actually not US into China, but just let's say countries outside China into China. A lot of that was connected to real estate and investment coming from other Asian, a lot of that connected to, say, the automotive sector. And but then we look at real estate in China, that sector has really matured. The automotive sector has matured. So therefore, the fundamental need for FDI into China has declined. And so as a result of that, if you just look at overall FDI, inbound FDI into China, that has not been growing. It has been pretty much stuck at 120 billion for several years, even as Chinese economy has continued to become bigger. The outbound investment from China into the US, that had increased tremendously. But then again, there were lots of horrible decisions made by, for instance, some Chinese insurance companies, some Chinese state-owned enterprises, and so on. And the Chinese government has, clamped down on those kind of misadventures by Chinese companies in terms of outbound FDI. And on top of that, on the technology sector, both US and Europe, and including Germany, have clamped down on acquisitions of the technology companies within US or Europe. And so now, in fact, even VC investment, that if it is sensitive technologies, Chinese VC investors are restricted from investing in the US. So yes, the capital investment, especially if you look at FDI or VC, all of those have come down.
Very good, thank you. One criticism of China has been that they were not forthcoming on the seriousness of COVID. Given the crippling and global nature of this crisis, do you believe that China will change their strategy and approach to future health environmental situations? And perhaps will the private sector put pressure on China to become more forthcoming with information?
Well, I mean, so rather than kind of speculate on what China may or may not do, because it would be totally wild speculation. But I think something else which is related to this question that's, let's say, one can say with more confidence, is that even though serious and horrible as the current coronavirus crisis is, a silver lining from this is that the world overall is now the risk of the world facing another viral epidemic like this anytime soon in the future have come down significantly, because the world, including China and the US, but not just China and the US, all countries around the world, certainly the major powers, they are going to become a lot better at monitoring the risk of pandemic, at predicting possible spread, sharing that information. the development of tests for antibodies, the development of therapies, development of vaccines, all of that, has been accelerated like crazy. Investment in healthcare systems. So as all of that happens and countries learn from this situation, I think the risk of future pandemics have come down. I firmly believe that, and I think that's great.
That is good news. We like that crystal ball
Yes.
outcome. One last question, as we have just a few minutes left, and your last thoughts on this topic is, what actually makes it so difficult for this relationship to work? And perhaps you have some closing thoughts as well.
Yeah, and so I think what makes it, firstly, for a relationship to, the foundations, or let's say in terms of the not the foundation, but the core factor that makes the relationship contentious is really the jockeying for power between the number one and number two. So as Graham Allison said in his book, that when you have this kind of a contention where a number two is challenging number one for supremacy, the relationship has always been fraught. Now, if on the two sides, if let's say there are cultural links, and cultural is probably the right way to put it. And so you look at the 100 years back, somewhat over 100 years back, when the U.S. Started becoming a larger economy than UK and took over from the UK, that they were massively strong cultural ties. Obviously, heritage in terms of US population, and how many of them came from the US, from UK. So when you have those kinds of ties, cultural, linguistic, just in terms of ethnic ties, then it is possible that the relationship, even as it transforms and number two becomes number one, you have a harmonious shift in power. But those kinds of ties do not exist, certainly not anywhere to the same degree that they existed between US and UK. And so that is what makes this relationship very contentious and not so easy to be optimistic anytime in the near future that the tide will turn.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. Thank you all for joining us. This webinar has been recorded and will include the slides. We will let all of you know via email when the recording is available so that you can review and share with colleagues and friends. We want to thank Dr. Gupta once again for this fantastic thought leadership series. Please keep checking back with us for more webinars and short courses and other learning opportunities from the Smith School of Business and Executive Education. Thank you from both teams, the Alumni Relations team and the Exec Ed team. We are here to support you in your lifelong learning. Please stay safe. And once again, go Terps. Dr. Gupta, thank you.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you, everybody.